Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming again. We're here for the second session of the first module of our 3-module series on Agile topics. Today, I want to talk about agility and Agile methods as the same way we did it yesterday. My colleague, Alan Brouilette, will be the master of ceremonies of the chat section of the talk, and please, if you put your questions in there, he will be able to stage them and get them to me, and we'll address them all the way through. Don't like to have a question and answer period at the end, so as the questions occur to you, if you'd go ahead and put them in chat, Alan will stage them correctly, and he'll probably call on you and have you ask it aloud. So we'll try to be as interactive as possible. I've also tried to cut back a little bit on slides today, on the off chance that we have more discussion and questions than we had yesterday. So we'll see how that goes. And without any further ado, a few sort of lofty thoughts that were left over from yesterday. If you remember, we were actually able to talk about what Agile is and what it's not, and talk about the idea of being Agile and not doing Agile so much, and the characteristics of it. We went over the details of the Agile Manifesto and the 12 Agile Principles. So we covered a lot of ground and all of the fundamentals. So what I want to do today is kind of think a couple of large thoughts about that, and then dive down into what it means to do Agile a little bit. And so we'll do an overview of the three of the largest movements, or the largest items from our Agile family tree that we talked about. We'll talk today in a little bit more depth, and still at the high overview level. We'll talk about Scrum and Kanban, and also something called Lean. So if you think back to what we talked about with the waterfall, we talked about, and many of you have been in waterfall software development projects, you know that most of the time the team is kind of busily working on things that are really not visible during the requirements and design and implementation phase in terms of actual product, actual value that can be delivered or examined. None of that's really in place. Much of the work is done in documentation of one sort or another, technical design documents and requirements documents, coding, that sort of thing. And it's not until we get into the test phase, or what people often call system test, near the end of the project, that we start to, as we used to say, we start to try to beat some quality into the software. And if we had started out way back in the lower left corner of the graph with a goal indicated by the sort of golden star there in the upper right, that was always our target, we kind of spent a long time meandering along, not getting really any visibly closer to it. And then all of a sudden near the end, we hopefully get on a very steep ramp and head for that goal when we get there in the waterfall. And we'll take a minute here later in the talk, and we'll talk about the difference between that profile of delivering value and the profile that we'll get when we're doing Agile, when we're being Agile, sorry, and we're doing Scrum or some other Agile kind of a methodology, because of this idea of iterative development, which is the other big thing that we spent some time on yesterday. And speaking of which, you'll recall that we touched on the Agile model of development, which was that we kind of built one small feature at a time, a little piece of value at a time, and we tried to build it completely so that we could use it, and we could view it, and we could examine it, and we could learn from what we had done, so that as we build subsequent pieces of value, that we could get closer and closer to what the customer really wanted, what really would solve their problem. And you'll notice in this new analogy for iterative development, where each feature is actually a nicely finished and wrapped piece of candy. Each piece of candy is different. Clearly, what our product will be a bowl of candy, probably maybe wrapped up in nice foil or something. But the idea here is that we add a feature at a time, the feature being the pieces of candy, and we can stop and look and, as we say, inspect and adapt and decide if we have enough candy in the bowl, and if the candy that's in the bowl is the right kind. If we need to add some more, maybe pull out some, put in some different ones for that. So we get a chance, as we're completing this particular product, we get a chance to make sure that it's something that customers are going to like and want. So quick kind of a different look at a way of thinking about this idea of iterative development that we talked about yesterday. Now, the thing is, and we've stayed away from this a little bit, although I know that a lot of you are suffering through it and living it. There is this concept that people often don't like to address head on. And the concept is that this doesn't all come for free. And so we drop back to the very famous, and as it turns out, unattributable definition that many people think came from, whoops, I have to go back, came from Albert Einstein. It turns out it's not from him, and nobody knows where it came from. But the idea here is the definition of insanity is to do the same thing over and over again and expect different results. And many of you may have experienced being in a situation where management or your organization, as represented by management, wanted you to do Agile because they wanted some of those benefits we talked about. They wanted some of that quick time to market and that better quality and that morale improvement and that customer focus and customer responsiveness. But when it came time for you to do something different from what you used to do before you did Agile, they weren't really as excited about changing the way things were done. And so they essentially put you into the position of being insane because they wanted you to work the same way you always had and yet somehow achieve different results. So the bottom line here, and it becomes very, very clear when you try to use Agile methods, is if you want different results, you have to change what you're doing. Just wanting it to be so doesn't work. And that makes a lot of organizations crazy. Not sort of running around this kind of crazy, but it does make, or it does stress out organizations and make it difficult for them. And when we talk about Agile adoption and Agile, or organizational sometimes, transformation, this is the part that Agile consultants and coaches are talking about. It's not the part about getting a few people to do Scrum, although that can be hard enough, but it's really the part about getting the organization to realize that our project plans look different, our commitments to customers look different, the way we manage and judge progress looks different, the way we manage risk looks different, everything is a little bit different. And that's a good thing because we wanted different results in the first place, because that's why we switched to Agile anyway.
If you're looking to see this phenomenon kind of in action, when you offer to change the way you're doing things and understand how Agile is a genuinely different way of working and a way of thinking, tell your stakeholders the next time they say things aren't working that you don't want more money or more people. Because you will see a lot of folks in particularly in government, though certainly it's true of private sector corporate America too, when you are the coach who says, no, I don't need 10 more people, I don't need another 50 million, I just need you to think about this in a different way, you will either get laughed at or you will have a lot of attention, because you will be very much an outlier in the people that come to them offering to solve the problem.
So let me cover one more slide, and then we'll see if we've got anything any questions lined up in chat. There's a corollary to this idea that I also wanted to mention that comes up, which is that when we're called on to implement an Agile methodology, like one of the ones we'll talk about today, people often find various parts of it are extremely difficult and some parts are very easy. And a lot of teams will early on kind of stop doing the painful things because they're painful, and feel like, well, you know, we're special and that doesn't really fit our environment, or that's not very important to us or for us, and things are going just fine without it. But I want to make this important point, which is that every time you're trying to implement an agile methodology like Scrum or like Kanban, and if you choose to ignore something that's fundamental about it, you're giving up some benefits somewhere, because none of these things are in the methodology for no reason. They're not in there for fluff or to make a nice looking graphic. They're there because they're part of the sort of ecosystem that the founders of Agile were trying to set up to make these things work well. So when a practice for one of the methodologies causes you pain, that's because you found a really important place, something really important for your team to work on to get past that pain. And stopping the pain prematurely by not bothering is actually going to cost you a little bit. So think about that the next time you do it. I often refer to it as do-it-yourself Agile. You know, and going back to my anecdote from yesterday, no, it's not all about having a meeting every morning, although that is one practice that Scrum prescribes. That is not the main thing. And really, there aren't very many people who are in a position to wisely choose a subset of Scrum and make that work. If you really want to do this and really want to get the benefits from it, start doing it the way it's supposed to be done. And when you get good at that, then you can start to jam and start to put in some things or take out some things that are better for your team. Alan, do we have any questions lined up yet?
Nothing yet, but if you're interested in one, I will, given what you just said, ask you if you want to go over Shuhari for these folks.
Ooh, you caught me naked with no slide. So I will. Let's see, that's a good question. By the way, next time, if you could warn me ahead of time, that would be wonderful.
I didn't know I was going to do it until 10 seconds ago, but I'll filibuster while you think.
No, I got it. So there is a learning regimen, I guess you would call it, or description of the learning process. It comes from Japan. It's called Shuhari, and it describes 3 stages of someone. It's originally was used in martial arts. And in the Shu stage, the student is meant to simply mimic what the instructor says. And you sort of thoughtlessly and mindlessly just do exactly what you're told until you get it right. And that's, of course, difficult work. And any of you who have taken a martial art seriously for some years know how difficult the katas are. The requirement that you kind of do these prescribed movements over and over again until you have them just right. There's nothing creative. There's nothing really for you to think about. It's just do this until it's correct. Similar with a musical instrument. And now I would add similar to a team learning Scrum for the first time. When your coach or your instructor tells you these are the things that you do in Scrum, you're not really required at that point so much to look deeply into each of the practices and decide the goods and the bads. What you're really meant to do is work on just doing them the way they should be. And that leads you eventually, as you've mastered that part of the learning curve, that leads you to Ha, which is where you've achieved mastery. And you can stop thinking about how difficult it is to do the correct things and start using them in the proper way. So in martial arts, that means you're not so worried if your elbow is here and your hand is here and the thumb is lined up and your feet are correct. Those things now, because of the practice that you've done, those things kind of line themselves up. And now you can think much more about beating an opponent using those martial arts movements. The same thing is true with Scrum or Kanban, where you've learned how to do the ceremonies, you've learned how to use the artifacts, you've gotten the cadence down for your team, and now you can really start to concentrate not on whether your daily Scrum meeting is correct, because it sort of naturally will be at that point. Now you can concentrate on the substance of what's happening in the meeting and how to use it best. And then finally, in a very, very sort of Asian, Japanese touch, you come full circle all the way around to Ri, where you are simply doing the movements again, just as simply as they were done in the beginning, except now you do it with full knowledge. And so the actual substance of the movements or the fundamentals of the practices are much more powerful. You don't have to think about them. You don't have to work hard to do it. They just kind of flow naturally from you, and you're back into a very, very simple state of mind as you execute these things. And this model of learning actually applies pretty well to teams that are learning agile methods. So I give it to you for your own edification. And yes, you can look it up on the web and learn a whole lot more about it. All right.
So good answer for no warning. Sorry about that. Please carry on.
Nicely done. I'll give you a quarter later. So moving on, I'll bring you back to the Agile family tree that we talked about. We learned what Agile is about. Agile actually is a descendant of something called Lean that we'll spend a few minutes on later today, in a little while. Lean comes from Toyota, and it is a very, very high level sort of organizational improvement regimen that has its beginnings in manufacturing, and Lean in a certain way spawned Agile, or should I say the people who understood and created Agile came from within this Lean tradition. And Lean is very much in contrast to Waterfall. It looks at different ways of managing, different ways of thinking about work, different ways of producing value for customers and all of that stuff. And then the Agile movement has spawned any number of different specific processes, Scrum being the most popular for doing software development, certainly around the world. Something else called Kanban that comes directly from Lean, but can also be modified to work well with Agile. And for some of you, you may be familiar with something called extreme programming. We won't go into extreme programming in depth. It's actually very, very similar to Scrum, except that where Scrum concentrates on project management and on the project as a whole, extreme programming really is all about the developers and the coding and the testing. And it's very, very much down deep in the technical weeds, if you will. Most good Scrum teams borrow a lot of techniques from extreme programming, so they sort of come along with it. But this is the overall structure, sort of philosophical structure of where these things come from. Lean, by the way, those of you who've heard of W. Edwards Deming, who was an American process control guy who, after World War II, had trouble getting his ideas paid proper attention to in the US, went over to Japan and helped with the rebuilding of Japan. And that's why a lot of these things have a history of coming out of Japan, because this whole kind of long-term movement started way back in the 40s in Japan after World War II, with other people from there, and then Edwards Deming going over and bringing his philosophy with him.
As long as you're talking about the family tree, Doc, Allison Stewart has a question for you.
Hi, Allison. What's your question?
I wanted to know if Lean Six Sigma is agile.
What I think I heard you say was you wanted to know if Lean Six Sigma is agile.
That is correct.
So a full disclosure, I am not expert at Lean Six Sigma at all. My understanding of it is that it is very much manufacturing oriented and metrics oriented, and doesn't actually address the same kind of things that Agile does. I have heard occasionally of people trying to apply it to software development, but I haven't heard a lot of giant successes with it. So I'm going to tentatively say not in a really obvious, easy way.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question. We have more?
Nope, on you go.
Okay, on I go. So let's talk about Scrum. Now we move from the world of being agile and thinking about those things and having a philosophy and a way of way of approaching problems and solutions for customers. We move into the doing. And Scrum, well, this is a Scrum. This is a Scrum in the sport called rugby. I'm sure you can see the similarities with software development immediately, as I do. For instance, you'll notice the Scrum halfback in the back of the picture who has the dental issues. I know so many software people who've lost teeth from horrible typing accidents, so it's a very, very similar thing. But Scrum was actually used, that was humor for those of you that are still awake. Scrum was used as an analogy for a certain way of doing product development back in the mid-'80s in an article in the Harvard Business Review by two Japanese guys, again, Takeuchi and Nanaka, who wrote the new product development game. And what they noticed was, or what they wanted to show us was that this rugby scrum, this formation that happens during a rugby game, illustrates a lot of the things that the best product development teams at the time were doing. They were working together very closely. That is, the team, you'll notice that the teams are holding on to one another. There's a lot of communication, both in voice and also in just kinetic, kinesthetic feeling with your teammates. It is a all for one for all. The team succeeds or fails together. There's no way for a single person in a red and black striped shirt here to succeed unless all the people on that team succeed. The scrum is actually an argument between the teams over who's going to get the ball, and so your team succeeds or fails by getting the ball or not. The other things about the rugby team that are important, they can't get to the coach very often. This rugby scrum can be the beginning of 5 or 10 minutes of nonstop action, in which time the team doesn't get to stop or talk to one another really, or go over to the sideline and talk to the coach. It might only be 10 seconds, but it could go a long time. So the team has to self-organize. They have to deal with the dynamic conditions on the field by themselves in order to succeed, in order to win. So that's why we call Scrum, because it's meant to evoke this idea of the kind of conditions that a Scrum team is in when they're trying to build software. So it's an agile product development methodology. Scrum is a complete embodiment of all of those principles and values that we talked about yesterday. So it follows the Agile Manifesto and the principles. If this were a 2-day certified Scrum Master course, we might stop here and do an exercise, or after we had talked more about the details of Scrum, and we would do an exercise and we would lay out all of the 4 values and the 12 principles, and then we would point to various parts of the Scrum methodology to show how each of those has been instantiated within Scrum. And it turns out they're all there, all the things we talked about yesterday. So Scrum is agile. It's agile. What I mean by that is Scrum follows all of the agile principles and values, but agile is not Scrum. So when people say, well, our team, we're doing agile, normally what teams mean when they say that is we're doing Scrum. And I have never quite figured out along the way how this kind of weird bastardization of the language happened. I mean, if we were football fans at the bar and we were talking about a forward pass, we would say that that was a football move. But we wouldn't necessarily call it an athletics move, right? Because it's all about football. But in the agile world, people insist on talking about their agile team, and usually they mean their Scrum team. I suggest you not get too pompous about that with your newfound knowledge. People don't always appreciate unexpected learning, depending upon how you deliver it, I've learned over the years. So know it secretly and in your heart that what they really mean is that they're doing Scrum. The process framework is extremely simple. It starts off with a nod to the Agile development model, again from yesterday, where we talked about building features separately, independently, and you can see the features that the team wants to build over in the left in the product backlog. The product backlog is a Scrum artifact. And all it is a list of the features the team intends to build, and they are kept in the team's best priority order at any given moment. The interesting thing here, again, you will hear lots of people say that a product backlog is one of the main characteristics of doing agile software development. That's actually not true. The product backlog is an important project artifact of the Scrum process framework. It's an important Scrum artifact. So most of the things that people label agile on a day-to-day basis, it turns out, seem to be coming from Scrum for whatever reason, I don't know. The product backlog is just a list of features that the team can build one at a time, and they're kept in priority order, and that's important. So the way Scrum works, for every iteration, and we do iterations in order to do iterative development. The name of an iteration in Scrum is called a sprint, so those are synonyms, they're synonymous. We start off the sprint with some sprint planning or iteration planning. Then the team goes off and attempts to build all of the things it's chosen to do during the sprint. In the middle of it, when it's done, we review what happened during the sprint. A couple of different things happen during that review. One is that we present something called a potentially shippable product, or some people call it sometimes a potentially shippable product increment. That is new working software that has the new things in it that the team has completed during the last 2 weeks. And it's like we always do in an agile environment. We said we wanted to create something that was observable, inspectable at the end of every iteration. And so that's what we have. We have working software, working tested and integrated software, actually. So we observe that, we show it to ourselves, our colleagues, our stakeholders, and our customers in a meeting called the Sprint Review. And then we also take the time as prescribed, again, in the Agile principles from yesterday. The team reviews its own work by itself, right? It introspects and does a retrospective to try to find a way to work a little better during the next sprint. So this is kind of a way to ratchet up the team's performance over time and get better and better and better. One of the many places where we get improvements in productivity, so forth in Scrum. So the only thing left to really, two things left to mention before we leave this slide. One is that when we first started doing Scrum in the early 2000s, sprints tended to be about a month long. And it was very difficult in those days. People were still new to this idea. It was tough to build some software and test it and integrate it and do all of that within a month. That was quite an accomplishment. Nowadays, Scrum teams typically do sprints of about 2 weeks. Extreme programming teams often will do sprints of 1 week. They have some slightly different techniques that they will use for that and a different style. But the idea here is that we're doing this, going round and round this circle of choosing to build some stuff, building some stuff, looking at it, seeing how it was, and going around and doing it again. The last thing that I would mention is I don't lazily label this the Scrum process framework. The idea here is that, as any Scrum team will tell you, as you try to implement Scrum within an environment, an organizational environment somewhere, it always turns out that there are exceptions, that there are special things about each environment. And so people carefully weave the Scrum process framework into the way they work within their own organization to make their version of Scrum. This requires a little bit of knowledge and understanding of how Scrum works, so you don't break it. But we do expect you to add in your own details about how each of these things happen, and how do you build your software, and where do you keep your source code, and how do you deal with input from your stakeholders. All of these things drive some more detail that comes out and that you're going to work into your Scrum process framework as you go.
Got 2 questions for you here, sir.
Go.
One of them, and I already sort of answered it with the product owner, but it's a little more complicated. Who determines the backlog priorities? How much customer engagement is involved?
Let's see. So from the
And we
shoe point,
already plugged the we plugged the basics of Scrum Part 1 coming on Friday.
nice. No, interesting. So that's a great question from the coming on from the Shuhari question earlier, because from the shoe point of view, the product owner owns the priority of the product backlog, and from the point of view, the product owner owns the priority of everything in the product backlog. It's just a completely different view of things. In the middle, what we have is that it's the product owner's responsibility to make sure that the product backlog is healthy and ready to help the team do work. So the product owner is tasked with coming up with the right way in their environment to get feedback from stakeholders and from potential customers or customers, and also from people and things like user acceptance testing, which is another source of feedback from customers, right? So the way we start that is the product owner is given veto power, and they generally work collaboratively with the team to come up with what they all agree is the best priority. And then over time, one of two things happen. Either the team tends to take over the prioritization under the watchful eye of the product owner, or the team says, you know what, we trust you, product owner, and why don't you just go ahead and do that prioritization and just tell us what it is, because we like the way you work and we have other things to do. I can say that there's a little bit of danger in that. In my last company that I worked at before I went on my own and then finally came here, the team and the product owner got to that point where the team said, oh, you know, we're kind of tired of messing with all this prioritization. You just go do that. And then for about a year, the product owner just went off and did that. And somewhere during that year, the team began to not like the priorities that the product owner was setting. But rather than bring that up in a team retrospective, or bring it up to management or to the product owner directly, all of which are giant failures on the part of kind of everybody, but mostly on the team, because they're the ones who were getting upset. They started to get upset, then they started to resent it, and finally they finally got so upset that they came into me. I was the CTO at the time, and they came in and presented me an ultimatum that said, we are not going to work with David anymore. He's a horrible product owner. He keeps telling us exactly how he wants the priority in the product backlog to be, and he won't let us participate in that. And I said, well, I thought that's what you wanted him to do. They said, well, no, not anymore, because we don't like it anymore. So anyway, it led to a really, really interesting and painful impasse. And as it turned out, we never did really rehabilitate David in the team's eyes. And it was coincidental that we had been in the process of hiring a new product owner to report to him, because he was VP of product. So it worked out well in that the new product owner came in just in the nick of time, and the process was reset, and everybody worked out a new way of working. So what we know is that collaborative is the most healthy, the healthiest and best way to do it. And within that, there's a lot of ways to adjust it and vary things. But overall, the final responsibility for that, for the priorities in the product backlog, belong with the product owner.
To that end, I'm going to pull Chris in, who was the asker of the original question, with the follow-up question, because I think at the root is a problem that we have run into an awful lot working in government. So I think it'll be useful. Chris, go ahead.
I'm not hearing any Chris's.
Nope. Oh, I got the follow-up here. So the team isn't necessarily in the engagement meeting with stakeholders. So does that make the product owner a liaison to the stakeholders?
I'm not so much worried about the words. I think of the product owner as actually finding input for the product backlog anywhere that they should, and bringing that back and putting it on the table where I hope they use it, they incorporate it with in a collaborative way with the team. So if liaison works for you there, okay. If some other word works, I'm okay with that too. But the model of finding that feedback and that input wherever you can find it. And by the way, there will also be input when the product owner reads some article in a journal or in an industry blog or something. I mean, it can come from anywhere. So the number of sources is not limited at all. And the idea is that it all gets thrown in the table. And after you work it through, you have this really, really nice, simple picture of the net end result, which is the product backlog that the team can use to work in a very efficient and simple way.
All right. Speaking of simple, coming back to the slide for a different question, then you can proceed.
Okay.
Looking here at the right side of that box, why would we want to do iteration review? What would be the outcome?
So there are two. Let's see. So there are three parts to that. The first one is the demonstration of the potentially shippable product, right? That counts because anything that has a bug, anything that doesn't work during the demo is not completed by definition, because it's meant to be fully tested and fully working. But it also is a giant communication mechanism to whomever to show what's going on with the product, because we now, if you remember from yesterday, the only thing we trust as an indicator of progress is working software. So it's only sensible to demonstrate that working software every iteration, or we won't really know where we are. We have no other way to reliably gauge our progress. So coming in, if I'm a stakeholder, coming in to see the things that were created during this sprint is a really important thing. So that becomes one thing. The retrospective is really key, because no team is as good today as it will be after improving every 2 weeks for the next year. I mean, unless you're just really a bunch of lazy people, you're just going to get better over time, and good Scrum teams get sort of unbelievably better over time. So we get some incremental improvement in productivity as a general concept, and it can be quality, it can be efficiency, it can be a lot of different things that come out of the team looking over its own work habits and trying to improve those. So there are those two things. And then the other thing that will happen in the iteration review is that we have a chance to get feedback. Usually it's the only chance we get from stakeholders. They'll stop by and they'll go like, oh, I really love that, or oh, or whatever it happens to be. It's a good way to get some quick feedback from people. So the benefits of that iteration, in fact, I think I might tell you, if you called me in as a coach, if you were not doing sprint reviews, if you were not doing the end of sprint ceremonies, I might have to inform you that you weren't really doing Scrum yet, and that you had a little ways to go.
We've got a couple more questions coming, but let's, I think we're starting to turn into, we're getting ahead of ourselves and turning into the Scrum class rather than the Agile class. So let me let you keep going and we'll come back to those. Excellent.
Excellent. All right, let's do that. So now talking about going back to our idea of delivering values, we start out in the world of Scrum with our same goal on the golden star in the upper right, but the world looks different because now we add value in a measurable way every single sprint. So we get a chance to look at our progress and we can see where we're headed. We may not achieve on the date that we projected the exact set of things that we originally projected. We wouldn't be surprised, because we're probably changing our mind almost every day during the project anyway. But the idea here is that in comparison to the picture we had in the waterfall, where you didn't really know anything until you were just about at the end of the project, here we have a very, very high level of transparency and visibility into what's going on, because at the end of each sprint, we get to look at what the product looks like. Talked about the Agile team yesterday. Here's what a Scrum team looks like. It's very, very simple. There are only 3 roles. There's the Scrum Master, there's the product owner, and then there is the team. And there are some characteristics of this team, and we'll talk more about this when we talk in depth about Scrum I guess later this week maybe. This team is cross-functional, which means that it has all of the people on the team nominally to build completed product. It has people who can do development, people who will write tests. It has designers. It has tech writers if those are needed. Whoever is needed to put this product together. It's self-organizing. We allow them the professional leeway to decide how to complete their work. This team is long-lived and stable. We like that because that gives them a chance to improve over time when they do retrospectives. They're dedicated. They don't try to work on 3 projects at a time. They have a very, very specific size, and there's a lot that goes behind this, but we typically expect 5 to 9 people on a Scrum team. 9 and above 9, and the team becomes unwieldy and it doesn't work like a single team anymore. And below 5, it's like, really, why bother? I mean, how much management technique do you need to have 4 people manage themselves? The answer is not that much. That even Scrum is a little bit too much for them. Although there's no law that says you can't put together your own product backlog, which is one of those things that's kind of always a good idea. Co-located, that's meant to deal with the principle that said face-to-face communication is the way to do things. And the first value on the Agile Manifesto, interactions between people over processes and tools. Co-located now has been expanded informally to also mean this, because we can interact between one another in video, which was something that you couldn't do back in the year 2000 so much. So co-located was the only way to really get a team to be able to talk to one another all day as they worked. The daily Scrum, that daily meeting, it's an interesting meeting because almost everyone gets it wrong. Again, those of you who attend daily stand-ups on Slack are not attending this kind of a daily stand-up, because your daily stand-ups on Slack tend to be almost exclusively status meetings, and that is not what the daily Scrum is for. The daily Scrum is a meeting where the team can self-organize, where the team who is working together, not independently, but in a collaborative way, will get together and organize their day and decide exactly who needs help when, who has time to help, who has problems. All those sorts of things are the things that you want a team to look at during the daily Scrum. So that's kind of a new idea that people have to get used to. Any more questions we should cover on Scrum before we move on to Kanban?
There's a bunch on Scrum. You want them now, or you want to wait until we get through the deck?
I'll take your hint and get through the deck. So let's move on. That's a quick overview of Scrum, as promised, and I hope it got you interested enough to get you to come back. What is this Kanban of which we speak? And we've mentioned it a few times. Kanban comes to us directly from Toyota and from the Toyota production system. It is really, and it has evolved into its own thing. It's an idea that depends on a certain model of work called flow. And in flow, we kind of work on things piecemeal, one at a time, a little bit like an assembly line, and in this picture, ideas or features or requirements, things to do, things to build, things to fix, all flow in one at a time from the left. They're actually worked upon at a certain point, and then they flow out as finished product, right? And that's called the flow model. And it seems extremely simple, but it's actually huge. And there are books written about this flow model and how important it is. And there are people who talk about not only economies of scale, but also economies of flow. So it goes all the way up to sort of an economic level model of things. Kanban uses it, and it tries to model this flow in a picture on the wall. The picture has columns in it, and work items tend to travel from left to right in this Kanban board. The ready ones in the left-hand column, when you're going to work on something, you'll move them into the middle column, and when you're done, they move off to the right. And the only other wrinkle on this particular board, you'll see that big number 2 up there, up next to where it says in progress. That is what's called the work in progress limit for this column. And it means that the team has decided that the most number of things we can be working on at a time is 2. And so we can't start any more new things until we finish one of these. And that tends to self-regulate the team's capacity with the demand for the team to do work, and which ends up having all kinds of benefits in terms of productivity and quality. So that's the basic minimums of Kanban. You can model it, and we have lots of techniques to work on different boards. At the other end of the scale, this is a board that's running an entire company. It follows the same rules. It's going from left to right. Every sticky note on this wall is something that's being worked on somewhere in the company, and each sticky note is in some state somewhere that's known and understood by the people who look at this wall. If you look closely, this is a floor-to-ceiling Kanban wall in a conference room somewhere. Clearly, you would have to spend some time learning exactly what's going on there, but that shows kind of the power of this approach. If you take certain steps about what work items look like and how they move around and how the team works with the board, you can use Kanban as the centerpiece of an agile Kanban implementation. You can use it for software, and if you think about it, this idea of flow works really, really well for maintenance and operations, where kind of things come flying in from the left, almost at random, and then we sort of regularize and normalize things with our work in progress. We do things as quickly as possibly can be done, and they come in sort of one at a time and leave one at a time. So you have a lot more freedom about how you do things than you might in the world of Scrum. So that's what Kanban is all about. It does that board makes your process visible. It implements this idea of the pull system with the limit on work in progress. It will also help you identify bottlenecks and waste, and we just really don't like waste because it's the antithesis of productivity. And also, we use the board to help stimulate change, because we still like the idea of the team improving over time, but Kanban doesn't impose any particular structure on how you do that in the same way that Scrum does, which you just talked about, the retro meeting. So Kanban can be a little bit dangerous in that it's meant to be applied to almost any process whatsoever in a flow-based system, but now you have to decide exactly what other checks and balances and artifacts and practices and other things you want to put around your Kanban board. And if you have very little discipline, you can have a Kanban board to implement your chaos methodology, if that's what you so choose by accident. Final thing I want to talk about today, and we're doing great, we'll have a little bit of time for questions. The ancestor of them all, Lean. Just to give you some idea of where it comes from, Lean is a very simple idea. It took root at a place called Toyota at the end of World War II, when Toyota said, wow, well, that was okay, but now we have a whole new world of business we've got to look around at. How are we going to do things? We have very small markets. We can't compete with the giant General Motors and Mercedes auto companies. What are we going to do? And there was a guy named Taiichi Ohno who implemented this idea of the Toyota production system, which was based on an extremely simple but powerful idea, which is look at the chain of events that comes from the order entering the company to the car being delivered to a customer, and remove all of the waste from that chain of events. If you could just work on sending value to customers and do nothing else, then that is the way to be the most efficient that you possibly can be. And it was way back then that Toyota set their goal to become the largest automobile company in the world, which they actually achieved. I think it was in the early 2000s. So this actually worked over time. And if you take that idea of taking the waste out of the value chain, that is the set of steps from start to delivery, and if you apply that across your entire organization, that's Lean. It's a big deal. It applies to all companies anywhere, all large organizations. Interestingly, it's built on two pillars, foundational principles. One is respect for people, and the other is continuous improvement, interestingly enough. all of the practices about how to do development and the lean principles of how to make these things work, how to apply it either in manufacturing or in office settings. All of these things are secondary to this idea of respect for people and continuous improvement. And of course, the foundation is management support. These things don't grow up in a vacuum, and they don't really work without constant management support underneath. Some of you will experience management occasionally just telling you to go be agile or be lean and then going away, and they've already committed a party foul. They need to stay there and be involved and kind of work with you during that journey. The goal of the whole thing is only to deliver value to the customer. I mean, that's really what that is all about. So lean has this idea of continuous improvement. You may have detected a theme here. They have something called the PDCA cycle, plan, do, check, act. They pick a standard place where they are, which is right now. Then they find a way to improve. That's the plan, do. Then they try it and they see what happened. And then they evaluate that and move up to a new higher standard. And they sort of continuously do that on all value chains everywhere in the company, kind of all the time, so that continuous improvement becomes an important activity. But the goal of it is to deliver more and better value to customers. So it really focuses things on the output of the company. So you don't spend as much time in theory on waste and waiting and bureaucratic silliness and all of the other kinds of waste that you can easily find in large organizations. No government jokes need be made here. So just a couple of thoughts, and then we'll move to questions. We've talked about Agile, and we've talked about some examples of Agile methods, Scrum and Kanban. We talked about Lean. These things work well together. This is a picture of one way you might take a design concept or a design methodology called design think and mix that with a development methodology called Agile, and notice that they come together there at that dot in the middle, which is also a sprint review. So it gives people time to go off and do their professional things and come together, so I can bring different disciplines, right, and different methodologies to bear all onto this same single development environment. So it's very powerful in the idea that it's not exclusive, but in fact it's open to working with lots of getting input from in lots of other ways, lots of other disciplines and professions. So something to think about. I'll just parenthetically say that it's clear to most people that have been dabbling in Scrum and UCD and things around throughout government that we, like everybody else in the private sector, are still working on figuring out how best to integrate user-centered design of various kinds with agile software development. The answer is there is no one best way, but you do have the responsibility of figuring that out in your environment. There are lots of different ways people have done it. Many of them will work. None of them will be perfect. So just be aware of that and expect that to be something that you're going to have to deal with. I think I'm going to stop here, Alan, and move to just a couple of questions before we hand it back to Daniel and the DigitalGov folks.
We have a lightning round them. They're all Scrum questions.
Okay.
From Megan. Does a feature get returned to the backlog if it's not completed?
Yes.
Mr. Kornfeld, what happens if priorities need to switch in the middle of a sprint, whether to the team realizing it or based on the direction of a stakeholder?
The overall, most general answer is I don't buy it. It's only a 2-week sprint. Don't change them till you get to the end. On average, you're talking about a week. The world will not end. Change your priorities when you get to planning the next sprint.
From Lou, does it matter that working software is in the developer's environment, not the customer's?
What we want it to be in is the environment that's as close as possible to the customers. That would be something the development team would want to set up. In most teams now, they set up sort of a staging environment and a production environment because so many things are SaaS now. And that place where that software should be working, the team wants that to be as close to its real life production environment as possible. So yes, it matters.
From Justin, is the Scrum Master a dedicated position, or is it filled by another role like an engineer or PM?
Both. So the Scrum Master is a dedicated role. It can be filled by what we sometimes call a working Scrum Master. A developer on the team can also be Scrum Master. The problem is that it's important, and their ability to develop will shrink measurably, because Scrum Master, it kind of grows over time. The better you are, the more time you spend at it. So it will really suck up the bandwidth of someone who decides to take on that role. Much better to have an actual dedicated person working with one or maybe two teams as a Scrum Master than having a working Scrum Master, in my opinion.
This next question has a two-part answer. The first part, Doc, will be from you. The second part will be from Jeremy Zeiler, plugging for everyone the next two classes in this series.
Perfect.
This is a question from Crystal. Can you describe the role of the Scrum Master and the product owner?
Yes, and we'll do that in the. We will be absolutely doing that and talking about the roles on the Scrum team when we have time to go into Scrum in more detail in the next module of our series, which will be all about Scrum. Basic Scrum takes a day to teach to a team. It takes 2 days to teach it to someone to be a Scrum Master. So we definitely couldn't do it in less than an hour. So we didn't even try. Just wanted to get the overview for you today.
JZ,
thank you, everybody.
You got those next 2 hours close at hand, Jeremy?
Sure. The next session that we have is the basics of Scrum, and that's on Friday, November 8th at 1:30 p.m. Eastern. And then the next week on Tuesday, November 12th, will be Basics of Scrum Part 2 at 3 p.m. Eastern. So you can find all those events on digital.gov.
Thank
I'm
you.
going to have to use an alarm clock to get up for that.
Dan, do you have a disclaimer here to add or something, if I recall correctly?
Yeah, I just wanted to once again say thank you to the Allens and to everyone for joining for today's presentation. It was a wonderful presentation, and we're really excited about the enthusiasm. We hope that you that have attended will be joining us for the Basic of Scrum Part 1 on November 8th. To register, you just click on that link that's in the chat box. And then more specifically, we really love getting your feedback. So please take a moment to fill out the post-event survey. That's in the chat box there. You'll be getting a notification email once the session wraps. The more information we get from you, the better we can create more dynamic content. So please take a moment to fill that out. Thank you.
All right, Doc, anything else?
Just thanks everybody for coming. This has been great. I really enjoy doing this, and it's so much better if I'm talking to somebody than just to myself. So really appreciate you coming, and thank you, Brouilette, for doing an awesome job.
Oh, these are always fun. We got, I think that should, you know what, I'm going to let you get out of here on a strong one. Peter had one question that I missed, which is, can you describe suboptimal teams, not co-located, distributed, part-time, and some ideas on how to deal with those, or should we use that as the tease for basic Scrum?
Same thing. I mean, yeah, any of those things I said, if those aren't happening, make them happen, and the team will move. Will move from suboptimal to optimal. Optimal teams are unhappy because they're miserable and because they're not succeeding. Once they start succeeding, I've never seen a team that's succeeding that was also unhappy.
I'm sorry, that you misunderstood the use of optimal. You had said optimal was co-located and dedicated teams.
Yep.
And we're, in my environment, we're always not co-located and not dedicated people.
Right. So what's the question?
So how do I adapt the sort of garden variety or standard Scrum approach to those contexts? We
might want to have a side talk about that. There are a couple things you can do depending upon the normal size of your projects and a couple of other things in your environment. I might have an idea or two for you. Why don't you schedule us a half an hour just to chat?
Excellent. Thanks.
Sure.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all.